Hello, everyone. Both here and not. Am I visible and am I audible?
Yes, to both.
Okay, cool. Give me just a few seconds to prepare. Why is this debate not about green tech and global warming? First of all, because it is anyway developing, because US is not the main developer of it. It is China. Why is this the case? First of all, they have already started this way earlier than US, so they have progressed way further. Secondly, they have incentives to push money into this because they have a whole industry that is dependent on it, hugely dependent on these batteries made of lithium and electric cars and stuff like this. Third of all, the government is pushing money into this like subsidies. Fourthly, they have cheaper labor. So this is why necessarily green tech is going to be on the market. It is going to be anyway, and this is not a trade of incentives of its development. Second of all, talking in terms of a long-term investment, most countries are going to use both green tech and oil. Why is this the case? Because you do want some oil for short term where you need it, but you also want to invest into green tech because this is a long-term something that is going to be reusable, something that is going to be sustainable. So most countries will just invest in both and use oil while they still have to. Third reason is that this actually does not change the amount of use of oil. Why? Because you having more of a supply on the market does not mean more people are using it. People are going to use oil anyway. Why? Because it is a necessity. You need it for your economy. You need it for cars to function. This means that just other economies and countries are going to buy it at a higher price, but no matter whether it's cheaper or more pricey, it is going to be used and you're going to have like pollution in the air and stuff like this. And fourthly, you're going to have, how do you say, this kind of a technology that is developing to regress green development, like you have carbon capture, etc. So this is why global warming, even if it's developing, you can reverse it, and over time, technology for its developing. And so this is not the crucial point of the debate. What is a crucial point of the debate is how people who do not have a good alternative, who have a limited budget, need to function, and also talking about states with this oil. This is our main argument, and this is that you get oil that is more accessible and more cheap widely across the market. Why? First of all, because it is cheaper to do. This is why you simply expand on it on its production in the US. Secondly, you have kind of an incentive for more companies to invest into this kind of a situation, but also for more companies to open up. So you get more money here, you get a lot of, how do you say, expansion of this kind of a scale. And thirdly, the info slide also adds that you can release reserves that you have not released yet. This means that you have a lot more oil on the market. And panel, please note, US is one of the largest producers, which produces around 20% of the world's crude oil. This means that this is a huge change in terms of how much oil is in the market. Piece of characterization which is crucial for why this is now specifically important, because there are a lot of conflicts which are fueling price instability for oil. What I'm talking about, first of all, specifically Iran. Iran is in conflict with Israel. This means that they're likely to soon close down the Strait of Hormuz, first of all, which is pushing through which a huge amount of world trade in oil goes. And secondly, they're likely to put less oil on the market to leverage the pressure on other countries so they can get benefits out of this. This is likely to happen because when they're in war, they do not have like a large developed military. They have internal conflicts and stuff like this, so they necessarily need some leverage in this kind of a situation. This is huge amounts of oil put out of the market. Second of all, conflicts in general which exist, which which are needed to fuel the war machines. This is like Russia and Ukraine, like Israel and Palestine and Iran, like India and Pakistan. All of these need and ask for a lot of oil to be used for machinery, for tanks, for production of war stuff. So this is why you have more oil taken off the market. This means that currently and into the future, in the current situation, which is a crisis, the oil is going to be, how do you say, a thing that is needed very much so. What are the impacts on our side of the house when you get prices that are a bit cheaper and when you have it to be a bit more available? First of all, it is cheaper for just people in America, but it is also not just cheaper for use, like for your car, but also for the entirety of the supply chains in the whole economy. Almost every business is using oil in its productions for its machines and stuff like this. This means that the whole economy gets to have cheaper production. But not just America. US is trading with a lot of countries which are in worse positions. We're also talking about countries like Latin America, like Mexico, like Africa, like some European countries. And in these poorer countries, it is terrible because they're in dire straits. And this is basically whether they can choose food or whether they can choose to buy some oil and stuff like this. And also in some developing parts of America, which are rural. But also secondly, in panel, please notice, this is crucial. The comparative is much worse. What do these countries use when they don't use oil? They use worse alternatives like coal, like burning wood. This is basically what happens in Serbia. When a Serbian normal, like a person doesn't have money to buy their oil for their home to get like warm in the winter, they go out and use coal and use wood to burn it to get themselves to heat up. Why are they likely to do this? First of all, because this is closer to them. Secondly, because it is hard to regulate because individual people can simply do this behind their house, like use wood, buy coal on the black and gray market. And thirdly, because it is simply cheaper than other alternatives. This means that when you do not have enough oil on the market, the alternative is you having more pollution in the air, people getting more sicker, especially in these countries which are developing. Before I explain how you weigh this in the round, yes, closing.
Global oil is regulated via OPEC. How would they likely respond to market distortion on the USSN?
I don't care. I'm just saying at least for a certain portion of time, you're going to get a lot of influence in terms of prices going down. But secondly, OPEC is very much influenced by the US. If US wants to put more oil on the market, it will simply be accepted. How should you weigh this within the round? First of all, compared to any other future potential stuff like maybe the global warming, we have a larger obligation to people who currently exist. A good argument for abortion is that even if the child should be perceived as a human, even if this embryo is a human, the mother is currently alive and we are sure that her life exists. This is why we should prioritize currently living people as opposed to potentially people who are living in the future. Second of all, it is a currently needed crisis that we need to solve in terms of like a lot of food prices and people who are basically living in bad conditions. For them, this is an everyday crisis we need to solve. And thirdly, we are talking about huge numbers of people compared to other arguments. Moving then to second argument, this is good for the US economy. Why? Because first of all, you're going to do more trade with other countries, so you get more money when you sell oil to them. Second of all, you get to tax all of the production and you get to tax all of the trade deals that happen and trade that happens. Third of all, you get more jobs that open up through these businesses. What does this mean? This means, first of all, you get more money for the economy, you get more jobs, which means that people who are laboring in these situations, which are in terrible conditions, get better pay, better conditions, talking about migrants like Mexicans and stuff like this. But also, secondly, that you have more money in the economy so that you can open up more businesses, more jobs. And thirdly and lastly, the government has more taxes so that it can provide more services to the people like better healthcare, etc. We believe that this is very important. Please, panel, vote for opening government.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech. We have opposition to commence opposition bench whenever you're ready.
POIs in the chat are fine. Panel 00 will clarify to you what this debate is really about. It's not about increasing the tax amount that the EUDC government has available to it, because indeed tax cuts are a part of the proposal. So I see no reason why, on the whole, this would encourage a net positive increase here. We all know the Laffer curve is a laughable concept. But beyond this, petroleum petrifies economies, environments, and indeed the world as a whole geopolitically. These are the three areas that we want to bring you in this debate. We want to tell you about the framing, what it looks like today, and how this impacts the world in terms of geopolitics and how it affects it in terms of the environment. Let's talk then specifically about our counter-proposal. The current beneficiaries of what the government proposes are the US government and oil magnates. They may talk about poorer countries, but they're systematically locked out of these resources for reasons that we are going to provide to you. What is our counter-proposal? We will invest in the most accessible and powerful sources of domestic green energy, so hydropower and nuclear. There's no reason why there's a trade-off between this and China. Presumably both will do it at the same time. But this idea of China doing it first, China having an industry dependent on it, and government money being pushed into it, That is identical with the US, so literally no analysis is provided as to why China is unique in this sense or why it even has to be a trade-off. But this idea of cheaper labor is also false because productivity increases where the US is more productive on these things due to economies of scale, having the largest economy in the world and the largest production in the world. The result is that they can still dominate that market. So let us tell you then what the framing is. Because in the status quo, the US is a net exporter of oil, so domestic oil consumption is likely not to change in this. Consider that under Trump, fracking expanded already enormously. Furthermore, through the restoration of green coal initiatives, there was an increased supply of energy available within the US, which meant that the oil reserves became in excess. This is why the US actually still holds oil reserves, because they can use them for geopolitical leverage, as I'll tell you soon. They're more valuable internationally now, so they keep the oil for export. All of the new oil, to clarify, will be exported if it is sold at all. This provides enormous economic advantages to the private oil firms who manage and operate all of the business that occurs here. These firms use their money and political capital to destroy the environment, to reduce labor regulations, and to cause many harms. Next area then, on geopolitics. Because we think that more US leverage controls the price of oil, causes this to become even worse in the world. Because when the US controls a significantly larger proportion, if we take opening government at their very best, and we assume that this will indeed be a meaningful change in the amount of oil available in the world, this simply creates a significant power imbalance for the US as increasing power over these countries. The opening government talks about it directly. Companies that are dependent on US oil through the EU, through the global south, through Latin America, who can only get it from the US because there is no trade shipping from the Middle East to Lebanon and from Lebanon to Latin America when it comes through these things, because there's simply not enough demand there, because it's been crowded out by the US market. So we have an entire continent dependent on US oil coming in through pipelines, going through Panama, Guatemala, etc. This cedes incredibly more control to the United States, and this is far worse. We know that the US controls oil reserves and supplies as a geopolitical tool. They've done this historically against Lebanon, they've done it against Iran, and they've done it against Libya as well. This is further evidenced by the fact that Trump and the current administration beyond him enjoys using tariffs as an economic tool. This means that they're not unwilling to use the market forces and powers that the government has on hand in order to shift the prices of things in order to get what they want and what they want to stand to benefit from in the world. This means that they're likely to control oil supplies, that they're likely to constrict it further, that they're likely to squeeze out as much as they can do. They're likely to sign favorable deals with particular allies who follow the Trump agenda or other things that support the current triumvirate, where the Supreme Court, where the legislature, where the executive all align on the same interests. It's almost impossible for any other actor in the US at this point in time to have any other influence. The real problems then with this are as follows. You have significantly less access for all the countries that opening government wants to care about for the reasons already explained to you. And secondly, at the very best, let's take them at the best case scenario. What would happen if the US starts to sell more of this, even though they don't have an incentive to, because they have a de facto grouping of small oil companies who control a significant enough proportion of the world's market to corner it, and thus all of them stand to gain from collaborating and raising prices artificially, because then they can force people to buy it at that higher price. This is something that only happens on this side of the house. I'll take the POI later. If we then take them at their best and they're going to pour out all this oil into the world, which they won't for the reasons outlined, what happens is that the global south would have no choice but to lock themselves into oil. And this is really terrible, because oil causes path dependency. An oil pipeline cannot be used for anything else other than transporting oil from a mine to the ocean. This is the only thing it can be used for. If you consider the comparative, which is green development, I know we're talking about the US, but the principle applies that electric grid development, which is a necessary part of developing green tech, can be used for literally all other electrical needs. This is because when you transport electricity, that can be used for all types of transporting electricity, as opposed to oil, which must be transported in its pure form. The result of this will be that they gain significant path dependency, and it is no longer possible for these countries, no thank you, to pursue other sources of investment, because it's going to be somewhat less efficient for them, or at least perceived as such by the spin doctoring of the oil lobbies in these countries. So what happens is that these leaders in places which are often democratically stunted must suffer and must inevitably choose the oil path, because it will be told as such by the oil lobby. This makes things far worse in these countries, because you destroy ecosystems and you destroy job opportunities. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Yes, open.
If US trades with just a few countries which are already rich, this means they have less demand, so they get less money. But also Trump is pushing for bonds with Mexico and how do you say, Africa. So this is why they're likely to be included anyway in this kind of a scenario.
Even if they're likely to be included, the US has such disproportionate leverage and unreasonable incentives that they're going to craft deals which are only favorable to themselves in the long term and ultimately to the oil magnates who control these decisions anyway. What happens then is that you lock these global south countries into a path dependency of terror, which destroys those countries and ultimately destroys the world. What does this look like? You destroy the environment. Other countries will keep producing oil no matter what happens, but this increase causes local destruction of ecosystems. Companies stand to benefit. Every dollar they gain, they can use to spend on expanding operations, which raises emissions, or they lobby to protect their own operations, so entrenching their own power. Flint, Michigan still has no drinkable water because of oil tapping and fracking, which occurs in its proximity. Global warming is reaching a tipping point as well, with catastrophic weather conditions becoming increasingly prevalent, also raising the risk of oil operations, causing spillages and leaks to become much more common. What happens is that you destroy local environments, rivers, floods, and all kinds of environments that can be affected by water or pipelines. The result of this is that even if you create some jobs, it's far less sustainable because you can get jobs through green tech as well, but you cannot get these unhealthy, unsafe working conditions like fracking, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, when you're working in even a factory line for green line development. So even the worst case scenario is better than their side. And for all of these reasons, we're very happy to oppose.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for a fine speech. I'd like the Deputy Prime Minister to close up the case for opening government whenever they're ready.
Okay, I'll begin shortly. Just let me organize papers. Safe or stable right now. That's it.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. Invite Deputy of Opposition to summarize top half whenever they're ready.
One second.
I'm sorry, my cat just died. I got a message, but we're not going to be break eligible if I'm not speaking right now. So we do what we have to do.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Okay, so can you start to Okay, so the most important impact of this debate that we're talking about is that we're helping the vulnerable within the US and other countries, as opposed to the richest of the world and the most destructive companies of US and the world, as OG is talking about. What we're explaining to you is that if oil becomes very cheap and the US floods the market, Latin America, global south, poor EU countries will be forced into excess oil consumption. And oil lobby and internal opposition within those countries will complain otherwise and potentially sway the electorate. Or if prices are controlled enough, global south must turn to Russia, Iran or Russia, which are far worse alternatives and will make much worse deals for these countries. And an oil-powered economy and industry destroys the local environment and ultimately the entire economy. And businesses leave Flint, Michigan, because you cannot have employees there, because people leave because drinking water is poison due to the oil fractioning that Trump already started, and that OG is proposing to continue on and increase the amount of that. Air locally becomes polluted from factory emissions, and the land becomes unlivable. Therefore, the it's impossible to have any successful like business environment or overall any like a reasonable quality of life there. So to summarize, our impact is that we will have more oil drilled, more oil burned, and that like it has to be true just from the info slide. Then that our benefits are not only not contingent on the price either going down, going up or down. That no matter what, the US is in control and has bad incentives, and like US want to secure unilateral deals which benefit their own government and the oil cartel. That locking them with exclusive contracts or as well as Latin America will become completely dependent due to infrastructure and path dependency. Yes, I'll take the POI.
Opening or closing?
Closing.
Okay, so like the US already has like quite a significant amount of leverage from like military strength, from like control over big bodies like the UN and the World Bank and stuff, and also from like economic pressure. Why is it specifically like US control over oil that's screwing over Latin America or Africa?
Well, every bit helps first of all, but also that by this, we are not just harming these countries, but overall harming the entire direction of improving green energy and the incentives and capacities of these countries to help the climate, like in the long term. So it's not only about their own agency and their own economy and quality of life, but as well as like shifting the incentive of these countries. Then, talking about the argument of competition with China, we still proved why US is better comparatively to China, as well as US doesn't have to lead the entire world in this anyway. Then, we're hearing from them that this debate is not about climate change and that it's not going to be a like significant amount, but we're hearing from them that the significantly more oil is going to be produced and wasted. That we do not have any reversing technology discovered yet to stop the like point of no return from happening. Therefore, right now, it's in our best interest and has to be an urgent priority to prevent this point of no return from coming up, as well as our impacts are long term because we're empowering the oil lobby and we're empowering the companies that on our side of the house would have stagnated with time and would lose power at the end of the day, while you are giving them enormous amount of leverage. And yes, as well as OG's impact is contingent of the fact that there is some kind of terrible crisis that is happening in the world that we has to tie up with more oil in the market. But first, I don't think they proved that there is any terrible outcomes of the crisis. They gave us reasons like worse, but they didn't prove the tipping point of why this specifically will cause such great outcomes. But even if there is countries that will suffer from the lack of oil, it's still good because that will incentivize these countries specifically and the world community overall to shift towards more green energy, like nuclear, like hydro stations, and as well as invest more into creating new alternatives, taking away even more power from these oil corporations that are destroying local and the global. So yes, and also that you're saying that there is no change because oil will always be consumed, but pretty straightforward that assuming it will be cheaper if US increases its creation, then the consumption will increase significantly more as well, which is furthermore proves our harms on the world and bring us over the OG in this debate. Thank you so much.
Cool. I'd like to thank the DLO for fine speech. I hope you're okay. With that being said, thanks for the top half. Move to the back half, member of government, whenever you're ready. Right, member of opposition to commence the case for closing opposition, whenever they're ready.
Hi, can I check that I'm visible and audible?
Yes, to both.
Okay, good. And I'll take POIs verbally, so just unmute yourself. CEO's case is simple. We'll expand beyond the localized context of GovBench. I'm unclear why we've pigeoned it only towards the US and how it impacts the US. It's not an active motion. We'll fill in the gaps of OO on that. But secondly, we'll also explain how if this is about the US, this incurs global retaliation, flipping most of government's claims. The first thing I want to deal with, however, before that is will oil prices be fine and sustainable? I think this boxes out most of opening government at least. I think first, the growing trend of oil usage is also coupled with their own analysis, how there's a growing trend of transitioning, i.e. given that oil is running out, we are transitioning away. So I'm unsure why this doesn't this necessarily neutralizes itself, even though more other actors are using oil, for example, for war. I'm unsure why the green transition also isn't pivoting and accounting for that. Second, on regional instability. Note that there's no analysis other than just saying in Iran there is something that's happening and they threaten to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. I'll explain to you why that's not likely the case. This knocks out even CG in and of itself. They themselves claim that war participants require oil, i.e. there's an incentive to de-escalate, not to the point where there's a restriction on the Strait of Hormuz, for example. i.e. if Iran restricts oil, Israel is also here and unable to get most of the oil that they necessarily export from the global market in order to fund their missiles, fund their tanks, etc. The feedback loop corrects itself and never escalates. But second, US and other regional allies like Oman are actively brokering a peace deal with Iran and actively have a ceasefire right now. Iran would also additionally incur global scrutiny for shading down the Strait of Hormuz, i.e. from trade and oil globally, which means that it's also unpopular and unsustainable as a policy. And lastly, Iran has always leveraged threats for concessions, i.e. prior to Trump pulling out of the NPT, they used nuclearization as a threat to remove sanctions successfully and set up the NPT. The worst case is that it's temporary instability. It was their burden to explain why it's indefinite and why we can't necessarily survive. I'll move on to the extensions then. But one extraneous thing on CG's case. I think their case just doesn't make sense. Insofar as it's premised upon investors pulling out and therefore there's instability. First, I'm unsure why this policy is a reversal and not just a discontinuation. I.e. per the info site, some of the policy expands towards continuous expansion as opposed to only just tax cuts. But second, obviously policy reversal does not require it to happen overnight. I.e. it does have to be tomorrow that there are no tax cuts and therefore licenses are revoked. Obviously in the span of a few months to a year, we can reverse it slowly so the shock is contained. But lastly, cost probably increases as part of US firms, but we don't think this necessarily creates the recessionary impact that they want. I.e. subsidies and tax cuts may no longer exist, but we don't think that they're necessary. Likely they were necessary in the industrialization phase where they have to compete with other OPEC nations in order to set up infrastructure overseas and domestically. Insofar as that's not the case, we agree and concede potentially prices are slightly higher, but it was their burden to explain why it would likely collapse and create a recession. The flip is that when oil eventually runs out and they have no pivoting strategy towards green energy, the shock would decimate them in the future anyway. Two extensions of CO then. How this reverses the green transition. I would note this engages with government bench insofar as OG localizes debate to the US and it's not an active motion. But first, why does this become a tipping point? I don't think OO actually establishes this outside of just saying there's less green tech innovation potentially. I think we will explain why this becomes a tipping point. Note that per the US's big beautiful bill, it actively right now removes many tax cuts for green initiatives and energy companies that existed, which means that the ability to compete actively within traditional oil suppliers and coal suppliers, for example, are necessarily removed. This then additionally decimates that survivability on top of the big beautiful bill, because now the operating advantage is already gone, but now all companies are going to be continuously given advantages and it's going to be compounded even more in order to necessarily produce, which means that previously if green companies could barely scrape by and survive within the market in order to provide green energy and sustain technology and innovation, opening both government teams destroy any capability to survive in the market and therefore reverse the effect of this necessarily happening. Note that we think this compounds given the US tech industry is very large, even if China also is filling in the gap. The US in Silicon Valley, etc., is also a major innovator on that part. But the second is that this signals a global shift. And this is where we engage with both government benches, or primarily OG. Even if it is true that China exists there to innovate, we think that what is more important is not a capacity issue in terms of development, but whether or not there's opt-in. This analysis will explain why there's no opt-in to the green transition, which means that regardless of if China is innovating, no one's opting in and utilizing it, especially within the global south. Note that this signals that in the short term, citizen incentives are legitimate to be prioritized on part of the US, which means that especially because it is worse, because the US is a global developed superpower doing this. Note that the narratives that therefore persist internationally is that if a developed country is unable to sustain green technology or the prioritization of green energy and pivots towards oil subsidies, then developing ones are also never able to stand a chance in that transitionary process. This shift then, if it's successful, means that all other states are justified in pursuing their own fracking policies or justified in not transitioning. So even if China keeps innovating, other countries are therefore not going to participate within that green shift because they point towards the hypocrisy of the West. The imposition of, for example, the Paris Climate Accord, COP26, etc., lose any inherent meaning insofar as the largest superpowers actively opt out. OG says this potentially removes dependency. Unfortunately, the only way is to decouple from oil altogether. In order to remove dependency, you ought not kill the green movement or green energy companies that exist there. Because insofar as you're able to do that, you're able to decouple from the Middle East if you have your own green transition. The impact is clear. This destroys things currently and in the future. Currently, the suffering from people all across the globe, whether from lung disease, drought, famine, or to death, you're complicit for because you remove and reverse the effects of this. But then in the future, everyone is also far worse off. This is comparatively more important than localized effects to the economy of the US before that opening.
We explained that China does this better than the US, but even if the US does it on a bit better level, the case is that on both sides you get green tech for all countries, so very marginal.
I literally just explained that the problem isn't technological capacities, it's whether countries actively opt into that green transition. I just explained that you shift global incentives when the large superpower that was actively funding green technology and green incentives moves back on its word and therefore enables other countries to actively keep polluting because they themselves are not adhering to their own climate strategy. The second thing then on why this incurs global retaliation if it's about the US. The first and very important to note is OPEC retaliation. I think GovBench lives in a dreamland where apps, when they pursue these strategies, release all into the global market that everyone would stand still and sit by. Note that 80% of the world's crude oil is collectively produced by OPEC nations like the UAE and like Malaysia. So the OPEC existingly cooperates with the US informally to agree upon prices and supply within the market. The US then can't single-handedly supply domestic needs because they're likely going to be countered by sanctions from the OPEC and other OPEC nations against other allied territories to not therefore import US oil. So the problem was then that oil prices fluctuate, etc. We think it becomes far worse when the global economy and OPEC nations, and given oil is such an important commodity for other states, are actively able to be coerced in order to sanction other goods within America. Note that this is possible post-Trump tariff policy, given that lots of economies, especially in the global south and in Southeast Asia, are decoupling towards it. So goods and economy become far worse in the short term for the US, but also incurs a global trade war that's worse for everyone. Note that it requires a response to this extension and it requires a response to this alternative to make sense within the world.
Cool. Thanks, and then opposition fine speech, government whip to summarize proposition bench whenever you're ready. Cool. I'd like to thank the government whip for a fine speech and invite opposition whip to summarize opposition bench and the debate as a whole.
Can you hear and see me? Okay, I realized I was muted there.
Yes, it does.
Cool. POIs verbally will not be looking at the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. First thing I'm going to do is rebuild evidence extension from the weak response we get from CG, then explain why green transition that he explains weighs over everything else in the debate before we then actually look at oil prices and see CG's weird take on oil prices and stability and explain why that actually doesn't happen, and then weigh the mitigated case against our case as well. First of all, on the extension, I think the extension was quite clear. The status quo, which is government, as all sides agree, it's very difficult to compete, i.e. green energy is very difficult difficult to compete with oil, with other forms of energy, for all the reasons Evan gives you. I think government also agree. We change this by saying, one, we stop producing oil under our side of the house. We stop giving the favorable expectations and favorable deals to oil companies within the US, therefore removing the advantage, making it far more competitive. Second of all, we create a global shift. And third of all, if all of government is correct, and we're assuming they're best, if oil is cheaper under their side of the house and more expensive under our side of the house, that also reduces the disadvantage and makes green energy much more favorable. The only response we get to this is in the second mechanism on the global shift, which they say, oh, the US is incredibly hypocritical and therefore no one's going to listen to them. Three things to this. First of all, we reverse this hypocrisy. We're the ones under our side of the house that are stopping Biden and whoever the next Democratic president is, whoever the leading Democrat in the US is, from talking about climate change and then not actually doing anything about it, and all the Democrats in the Senate and the House voting against climate policy. We reverse this by changing the direction of the US, therefore meaning the countries are likely to follow. Second of all, I don't think this is just about a larger narrative or a global shift. I think this is also about just hard facts and trade deals. That's to say, a lot of countries simply seek trade deals with the US simply to buddy up to them, to get closer, to gain favorable advantages in other areas of global politics. So I think what this means is when you're producing oil, you go to the US for oil deals, even if they're slightly more expensive than other ones, because you want the US's favour. But if the US stop producing oil domestically and instead produces green energy or starts producing green tech, then you go to the US for green tech and green energy. You go because of the same reason, but you're buying different things, and this is often how international trade works. But the third thing I want to say is that the US's biggest person that they export to is the EU, and the EU is very, very capable and is currently changing towards green tech. Therefore, if they completely stop exporting to the EU or massively reduce the amount they're doing, then the EU is pushed and forced to turn towards green tech, because otherwise they have to set up entirely new trade deals, entirely new infrastructure, because the fact is the US produces light crude oil, whereas a lot of the Middle East produces heavy crude oil, so EU and refineries are not made for other oils, therefore they either need to start again there or start with green tech. So I think specifically that analysis on the EU means it's incredibly likely that we're going to force a green transition there and in other superpowers across the world. I think that deals with the response on global shift, and I think that still stands. But even if we don't stand on global shift, I think the rest of the argument they do not respond to. The first thing I want to do, therefore, is differentiate this from OO, because there's some comments about how we're derivative, etc. I just don't think that's true. Two things. One, Eva's analysis on why we currently cannot transition towards green energy and why that changes practically builds on what OO says. OO says that in a one-off line, and they just keep repeating. We actually explain the analysis behind that. But second of all, the entirely new mechanism on a global shift is far more important and completely takes it over OO, because OO don't say this at all. And the problem with OO is they fall to lots of government responses. Yes, it is true to a certain extent, but we'll deal with this preemption in a minute, that China is producing green tech. OO never explain why China is not a problem when that preemption doesn't take down their case. Even if we don't deal with the preemption, I think the new global shift analysis sidesteps that, because it explains why we're moving away from China and why we're able to persuade countries to go towards green tech. Because the problem is many countries do not like China and do not follow what China is going to do. Yes, you have countries that follow because of the Belt and Road Initiative, but you have other ones that don't. Therefore, they lack a global leader and they lack a global superpower to follow. The analysis M gives you on the global shift explains why the US is needed to be a leader in the green transition to be able to access these countries that don't follow China. So everything they say about China can be true, but we're accessing even more people to follow a green transition, which is needed to actually access the impacts of a green transition in the first place. Let's look at the preemption we get from OG then, and a weird line from CO as well. They give you four things. First of all, they say China is the primary developer of green tech and therefore a greater capacity. But I think Evan already deals with this when he tells you Silicon Valley exists in the US and is the large producer of many, many different techs. But even if that is true, I think China is just a really, really bad actor to have leading green tech. Look at all the things they did with fucking solar panels. They basically bought up all the other companies that were creating solar panels, made and lowered their prices and completely outcompeted them. And then when all the other companies were gone, they raised the prices astronomically high, so very many people are not able to afford solar panels. I think those are sort of incentives and sort of undemocratic practices you do not want for the green leader, and I think that's just bad, even if they have a capacity to be able to do it. Second of all, they tell you, oh, we're just able to reverse climate change in other ways. Like, that's a throwaway line. Give me an actual analysis as to why you have the technology to do that, but also why you have the incentive to do that, considering that's not actually profit-making activity. But third and finally, CO tells you, oh, Trump just doesn't care, but also like Democrats just don't care about green energy. The thing is, and what Evans' analysis showed you, is that we force them to care because there's no alternative. If it is true that we are discontinuing and reversing all the policies on oil under our side of the house, and considering you either don't want to go to OPEC for political reasons, their prices are too high, or because they simply are freezing you out because of the actions that the US has currently done, then I think this means you have no alternative and therefore just need to turn to green tech. Even if that only happens by the private market and isn't done by any government subsidies, there is a hole in the energy market there that needs to be filled, and that is why we get it under our side of the house. Let's weigh this over everything else. The first thing I want to do is weigh it on the long term, because all of CG's analysis on why oil is likely to run out is perfectly true. All their analysis on why it's difficult to restart energy is also perfectly true. The problem is they provide no solution to this at all. What we do is we tell you we have a solution, but also we have a solution that provides cheaper energy into the long run, therefore winning on OG's metric as well. Because green energy is cheaper because you don't need to transport physical things, but also it's just cheaper to maintain because you're just leaving it out in the sun or the wind. Therefore, I think in the long term, we actually win on both GovBench's metrics. But second of all, Evan also weighs on the suffering that individuals experience when they suffer climate change. I think that takes it over. Let's deal with their cases then on oil prices and investor stability. I have a couple of responses to this. The first one is just to bring back what Evan said on OPEC and expand it, because I think he explains why OPEC are likely to have massive profit incentives to completely cut the US off and also cut the amount of oil they're selling on the market if the US massively increases their margins, because they want prices to remain high, and to do that, they need to keep supply low. That deals with OG because it explains why even if the US is producing lots of oil, the amount of oil on global net stays the same because OPEC changes their actions, but also deals with CG because it explains why OPEC is likely to sanction the US if they continue to expand their oil production because they do not want a competitor. Those sort of sanctions are the things that are likely to scare investors and piss them off, and that's when you get this investor run under their side of the house. But I also think everything on GovBench is incredibly speculative in terms of when it's about pricing and investors. Our impact's a lot more certain because there's a problem we're facing down the line and we need to create a solution. The only way is to find an alternative energy source. So proud to oppose.
Cool. I'd like to thank Opposition Whip for a fine speech and all the debaters. It's been a great debate. We shall see you in 15 minutes. Cool. So thanks everyone for a good econ. We do love a good econ. There's no real points of general feedback here. I think the analysis was fairly both intuitive and in places quite strong. I think a larger determinant of this round is weighing of particular arguments against one another. Teams that did better in the round were those that made active efforts to either weigh analysis or weigh clashes in ways that revealed or did not fall into traps of interdependency. As I think the two clashes in the round obviously are environmentalism versus economics. A lot of these two clashes actually at the end of the debate have a lot of similarities between the two in the way they end up working in the debate. Some teams implicitly recognize this, some teams didn't. So that's the only general commentary of the round, is to think about how clashes interact with each other, even if they have different names. Cool. The call, we had slightly different conceptions of some clashes, but we did resolve to a unanimous decision, even though I'm technically the only one that can vote. So we give the third to closing government, the second to opening government, the third to closing opposition, and the fourth to opening opposition. We think the clashes were largely solid. GovBench is fairly close, as analytical extensions often are. Commentary satisfied. Cool. So to pursue chronologically then. So what happens on top half? So the two dominant questions that it resolved top half are the following. So the first is, will the US use their kind of asymmetric leverage to meaningfully increase supply, is what opening government argues would happen in order to decrease the price of oil and therefore decrease the cost of living? Or are they going to use their monopoly oligarchic power in a way that produces things like price gouging or like pernicious contracts in terms of opening opposition, which not only would preclude the access of cheaper oil, and thus preclude the economics clash from opening government, but also engender a different harm, which is sort of some pernicious type of contracting that is bad. This question resolves in the following way. So we do think the US has some types of asymmetric leverage, but we don't think the asymmetric leverage is only experienced by the poorer nations as a result of this policy. In fact, we think opening government meaningfully demonstrates that this is just sort of a substitution of one type of leverage for another. The way they do this is opening government describes quite truthfully that if nations are so dependent or so needing of oil, either they will get their oil from somewhere else, or, as DPM argues, having more oil in the network means you have slightly better capacities to have less pernicious leverage. This is the intercompetition reason that DPM provides. Granted, the framing of open government is that we're currently in a massive scarcity of oil, so how often it is true that you could have optionality is in a question. But at the point at which that is questioned, the point at which the activation of leverage in itself asymmetrically is also a question. So if everybody really wants oil now, you're going to be dependent upon somebody. The less dependent you're on oil, the more DPM is correct that you can compete against each other to get some type of better deals. The only challenge opening opposition has to this understanding of top half is to say that, well, actually the US can build contracts in ways that exclude other people. And this is the DLO reasoning, or DLO sort of asserted claim. I think this is plausibly true. I think the US has the capacity to have these types of contracts. I'm just not sure if this is like uniquely everything they can ever do. And then I don't think this rebuts opening government's intuition about intercompetition or the capacity to intercompete for better contracts. Indeed, if opening government is correct that the US actually wants to maximize their amount of money, it suggests it's not in the incentives of the US in order to price gouge. Granted, opening opposition and pushing the other intuition, which is this is how they gain a lot of capacity. A lot more, how the US gains a lot more money is when they do contract gouging. This requires, I think, more justification from opening opposition to explain to me why the alternative opening government provides, which is like you just use other types of energy like coal or trees, couldn't be used as an intermediary while you're considering things like contract negotiations, or actually why there's a meaningful trade-off against green energy. So opening government also describes that, okay, let's say opening opposition is true and you now have to choose between being dependent upon the US or doing something other in terms of other green stuff. Maybe this is just creating a leverage somewhere else for somebody else, like green technologies. Namely, if opening government is correct, that I should prioritize the poorest nations in the world, it's actually maybe unclear, even if I'm the least charitable to opening government about intercompetition and leverage, whether or not leverage is not symmetric. Considering that opening opposition doesn't really justify asymmetrically why the pernicious leverage of the US is uniquely harmful as opposed to any other type of asymmetric leverage, it's not therefore clear why you're not just substituting one leverage for another. And thus, whilst I do think asymmetric leverage can exist, opening opposition is correct, I don't think it meaningfully means that you don't have an increased supply of oil into the market unless you don't get what opening up wants. This is just to say it succinctly, this challenge has an impact that we are unclear why it is more important in economics, and the response in its virtue doesn't prevent opening government from accessing their impact. So therefore, the second and more dominant question on top half is, what ought I care more about? Should I care about the economics of the world, or should I care about the environmentalism of the world? Opening opposition argues I should care about the environmentalism because with their counter policy of now investing more green technology, the poorer nations opening government identifies that are really in need of oil, and the supply chains of the world that are really in need and dependent upon oil would be best served by being less reliant on it, so you don't get things like oil spills, less damage to the environment. How does this interact with what opening government provides? The first problem here with the analysis is opening opposition has yet to justify why the counter policy has efficacy. So you're allowed to have the counter policy of you're now going to fund tax, you're going to have tax breaks, and you're going to fund green technology, etc. There's actually no reasoning in opening opposition yet for why poorer nations that opening government identifies can and indeed will pick up this green technology. Opening government does have the inverse, which is to say they are dependent, as opening opposition concedes, on oil, which means if you gave them oil, they would buy it. The same isn't true in opening opposition's world. I don't know why the poor man in Romania is going to buy an electric vehicle. It's just a flippant way of saying this. Considering if, as open government and closing government argues in the round, and indeed opening opposition does not frame, there isn't actually currently technology or infrastructure to have this kind of stuff to begin with. So I'm not sure where the demand comes from. This is a missing burden identified in opening opposition. That means I don't think you actually activate being able to have different environmentalism, as in better environmentalism per green policies. What instead happens is opening government's version of the world, which doesn't receive a response from opening opposition, which is if you are poor and you need fuel, what you do is you use worse forms of fuel, like coal or wood. So if environmentalism is damaging, I'm not sure why like non-renewable energies like coal or trees or stuff like that is not actually also harmful. So I don't actually think you prevent environmental harm. Per opening government, you actually slightly make it worse. The absence of this response means that even if you wanted to weigh the debate on environmentalism on top half, you'd still be losing to opening government. However, at the end, we do choose to weigh on economics for a central reason, which is that opening government convinces us or gives some reasons to believe we should prioritize this rather than long run stuff. So opening government explains why the short term ought matter more in the debate because we have an obligation to those that we can certainly know exist and we have more reasons to believe are actually directly harmed, as opposed to future environmentalism stuff. We also throw in the line about carbon capture storage and that maybe there's possibilities for future reductions of environmentalism that aren't stopped by this policy. That bit is less developed, but it's an interesting intuition. This therefore explains there is a certain there is definitely a potential for an economic harm that affects a lot of people on opening government versus it's unclear if there's an asymmetric advantage to environmentalism or not. So the only actual clash that has a difference is the economic one, which is why another reason why we should default with other than just the explanation opening government gives that isn't challenged. So those two reasons describe why we weigh economics. Opening government is described by the quality of life people gets worse if they have to pay more for oil, particularly in worlds where we have status quo conflicts, where oil prices are becoming constrained. Indeed, there's peripheral argumentation, but exemplifying the argumentation about how it's actually generally good for economy if you can have more employment, more trade. Here's a question here about mutual exclusivity. Funding in one area precludes funding in another. So this exemplification in the PM is underdeveloped, but is still a good exemplification of why it has compound benefits. So that is how we see top half then. So environmentalism might actually be benefited by opening government policy, ironically, but definitely economics is. And we can see why economics matters most. Cool. So that is what we see on top half and why we resolve it to close at opening government. What happens on the gov bench? Gov bench does classic analytical extension. So closing government justifies two things. First, they justify in a piece of analysis a more certain manifestation of opening government's principle. You can tell I really like principles. The closing government manifestation of the consequential harm, and secondarily on a wider effect of economic instability. All I'm going to say here, all closing government is able to do is to show that opening government are meaningfully more certain by accessing an immediate argument that has fewer steps of analysis. So if we zoom out and take a look at what the analysis is on the gov bench, or the analytical contention on gov bench, it is just who better convinces the panel that this policy actually it makes a meaningful change to people's standards of living. Opening government's contention is you incentivize oil distribution. Oil gets more produced. This oil therefore distributes to people. People then use this oil in a way that is good for them. Closing government step is you remove something that companies have already currently baked into it. They're baked into their financial statements, whatever. This causes like a chilling effect. People pull out investment and therefore you have a reduction of the supply of oil because people are no longer producing as much of it. Why do we prioritize the closing government analysis over opening government? Namely, why do we think it's more persuasive in showing actually why the oil prices in the world change? This is both explicitly justified in government whip sufficiently, which is it's the immediacy of impact. Secondarily, it is the adaptability insulation. Namely, that what opening government's analysis does is there's multiple instances in opening government's analysis where the market might adapt to marginalize the impact of opening government. So maybe it is true that the market dynamic shifts because there is an actual difference in the supply of oil. This might not have as big of an effect as the immediacy of investor flight, which doesn't have this adaptability effect. This is just a good illustration, quite rare in VP debating, but is a good example of what analytical weighing looks like. This is a convincing justification that the analysis of what happens to investors in immediacy is a better justification of why oil prices are likely to change, and thus a better justification to why the quality of life of people will change per opening government's metric. Closing government does not need to reiterate every other aspect of opening government to be more persuasive per the judge manual. They just need to add a more compelling reasons and explain to me why they're doing opening government better, which is what they did in this instance. So they are beating opening government by us being more convinced that people's standards of living is not as harmed. It's like a negative delta as opposed to a positive delta, but it's still a delta, right? We don't care. The judge manual does not make me care more about positive versus negative change. It just makes me care about the certainty or scale of that change. Closing government is winning on the first claim on the certainty of that scale, as in it's less bad on ops world, on a gov world compared to op. The second is then the scale impact, which is trying to justify why the future viability of this industry is impaired. They explain this by saying that it's much easier to continue to develop something than to start again, and therefore proposes a comparative environmentalism. I don't think this is necessary to be open in government. I don't think it is weighed to explain to me why this analysis was incredibly important. I'm defaulting to open in government's best case, as in the way open in government would win the gov bench is on that economic clash, considering nothing else is counterweight in closing government against economics. Given that the first extension is beating them on their opening government's strongest case, I'm not going to prioritize talking about the second extension because it's not important in order for the final deliberation. Cool. How does then closing government interact with opening opposition? This is maybe where the second part of the extension becomes more important. The crucial thing that happens in government whip is responsive material to environmentalism. So operating on what opening opposition has done in the round, they have demonstrated that maybe there is a degree of power imbalance and asymmetry. We don't see any unique responses from closing government about this asymmetric leverage capacity. So let's give opening opposition their due and say, considering it isn't responded to, you get slightly more pernicious contracts in opening opposition's world. How does CG then forge a path to victory, even though they didn't respond to this claim? The first is they justify, similar to opening government, why actually the short-term manifestations ought matter more than the long-term. This is done, and in some ways, I think this is a better response than opening government for reasons I'll describe in a second, which is CG just justifies why the reason you care about environmentalism or environmental impacts is because it engenders some harm to a person, as in death or illness or reduction of access. But in some ways, that's what the economic stuff does as well. So people die in economic recession and economic flight. I don't think closing government, by the way, like proves that the world's going to tip into a recession. But I do think the analysis is sufficient to demonstrate there'd be some global chilling effect on the production of oil, and from that, some bad economic aspects. What this does then is it collapses the clash of economics and environmentalism into just who do I think on the short diagonal is more likely to persuade me that people are actually harmed as a result of the policy change. Opening opposition's world, people would be benefited because this policy would produce green energy, but also reduce oil, which would prevent oil spills and bad things happening. This is plausible. This probably happens in some instances. I think closing government is more true that they actually do create chilling effects in economics that actually manifestly do harm people, but quite quickly. So the scale of harm is greater than CG. The certainty of harm is greater than CG. And as per the weighing of government whip, I ought to prioritize things that actually cause most harm in the round in the short term, given that we are less clear what actually it does exist in the long run. The second part of the extension in closing government about the instability of supply is the instability of being able to restart the industry has some implications about the long-term viability. But I don't think this is the important part of the short diagonal clash. That is correct. Short diagonal clash. So I think the most certain claims of opening government, and that's the most persuasive ones, are actually those that manifest in the short run rather than the long run. So I don't think they're accessing any part of their long run yet, considering their analysis does not demonstrate an actual change in the world, just a potential change. And thus I'm going to operate on opening opposition's best case, which is what happens in the short term, which is why I'm choosing to weigh the short diagonal on the short term, not the long run. Nevertheless, CG has demonstrated to me why the long run ought collapse into the short run. And thus that's a second, less insertionary reason to think that. Cool. So that's how I see that. That's how, we see the short diagonal. Last on closing opposition. What does closing opposition provide? On opposition bench, they do in some ways a similar thing to closing government with OG, as they just increase the margin to which I believe opening government is true. How did they do this? The first is quite it's sort of really sort of implicit, but what they are doing is basically just the inverse of CG's place. So they're just doing a signaling argument, but for green tech. And their asymmetry is that actually the oil industry is sufficiently well established, but the green industry isn't. And such, by pulling out of fossil fuel subsidies, you're positively signaling to green subsidy industries, and thus people invest more in green subsidies, which is good because we need to transition green. The first thing to say is this is more compelling justifications for why the world actually changes as a result of the counter policy, as opposed to just the claim that it does. So the end of opening government is just a claim that we are making oil less cheap, and thus people change their minds. Yeah, maybe. But then closing opposition signaling analysis is more convincing to us that this actually does manifest a change in the round, as in it's actually just using closing government's profit incentive analysis against them, which I think would apply to more numbers of investors than just the claim that they care about oil prices. If they care about industry prices in general, which is what closing government is convincing itself, then we must believe closing opposition true that the signaling effect for green industries would also work as well. Overall, opening opposition then demonstrates that maybe you do have a green tech transition in more instances than not, and this is therefore a meaningful extension and is better proving opening government's own impact. The second is the benefit of making people opt into green technology more. Whilst we think this is weak relative to GovBench, it is nevertheless stronger than open opposition. So not only is now demonstrating a capacity change, it's also generating an incentive change. So not only is there money for green technology, at the end of closing opposition, there's now an incentive for countries to move into green technology more. This is the question we had on top half, as I hopefully you remember 15 minutes ago, is we don't think opening opposition has demonstrated incentive of countries to now go to green technology or capacity to do so. Closing opposition is addressing both of those questions rather, and thus is beating opening opposition on their own burden problem. The latter claim from closing opposition is about OPEC, namely that oil industries, that the reason, so this is then where closing opposition is now starting to interact with opening Gov Bench more, and is the independent path to victory for CO. We think CO has a better better response to challenge to Gov Bench than opening opposition did, by explaining why OPEC is likely to backlash on the US doing this, which would preclude the US from being able to distribute the oil in a way that would actually result in a meaningful change in oil prices. Whilst we don't think closing opposition achieves the full claim, and then I'm not sure how certain it is that OPEC is doing this, or if OPEC did it, how much it would prevent the oil market from being changed. Nevertheless, it is not massively, but it does produce a mitigation about how plausible open government is, more so than opening opposition. So those are the 4 ways in which closing opposition is beating opening opposition. Finally, on the other comparisons, and the round ends the closing opposition relative to Gov Bench. On the long diagonal then, this OPEC response is quite important, but is underdeveloped enough such that opening government is still accessing oil prices. As in, open government is still convincing us that oil prices are going to reduce, which is beneficial for the economically dispossessed nations. Even if it's the case that investment shifts or investment incentives shifts, it doesn't, and indeed the oil industry is still established, it doesn't argue why we don't need even cheaper oil prices and even more oil. So there's still a margin to opening government on cheaper oil prices. The strategy in opposition whip is to challenge the metric itself, which is to say we should care more about the environmentalism in itself. The justification here, unfortunately, is undebaked. So if I was convinced that OPEC is going to prevent individuals from accessing oil, or if I was convinced that the leverage is more important than economics, then I can see why the 2 responses, opposition whip levies, are true. So I think closing opposition explains why actually China might be a more established member of the green community, as opening opposition says, but potentially therefore has asymmetric leverage in that industry that might be bad. As I've already explained in top half, we don't think the leverage argument is beating opening government, and thus leverage responses don't preclude opening government from the weighing they've done on economics. Thus, the challenge has to be why I think economics matters more or less than environmentalism, as indeed closing government justifies, bringing the whole Gov Bench. These 2 things are actually quite interlocked, and the reason for this is the reason we care about environmentalism is the short-term harm or long-term harm that manifests to individuals. If opening government, as they do, has still convinced us that the oil prices are going to be reduced and thus people's economic privilege is going to be greater, especially in poorer nations, and they're going to use less bad forms of fuel, it seems that this is less directly harmful to them both economically and environmentally than the provision of green resources. Because indeed, there's a question upon off-bench of just presuming that the production of green technology is by its nature good. The only example on off-bench about environmental harms is like CO2 production and like leaching. Both of those things happen massively with green technology as well, unfortunately. But let's ignore that response. That's the one I would have given you. So you do get economic harms still manifesting in closing opposition. There's insufficient justification here about why there's more suffering from environmentalism than economics. Doing that answer would have made it clearer why closing opposition is beating opening government. On the back half then, the challenge closing opposition presents to closing government is to say the signaling is asymmetrically utile, as in the member of opposition says that actually the oil industry is in more of a stable position than the tech industry, which is why the green tech industry needs more subsidies and stability than the oil industry. Maybe this is true, but it doesn't explain why I shouldn't still prioritize the oil industry, as in there's still a margin of signaling that emerges at the end of closing government. So what you're basically saying in the response is, well, there's 2 responses you give, right? The first is that, oh, we can still do it in status quo, but you can still harm in status quo, and then some signaling is still bad, or else your argument wouldn't work in itself. And the second is that you can roll it out in a smart way. Maybe you can roll it out in a smart way. I don't know why, but let's say you do roll it out in a smart way. Closing government's response preemptively to you and implicitly to you is, this is what the smart response looks like, if people are prioritizing their own pockets in ways that make sense that they're not going to receive loads of money. So it's unclear why by rolling out in a smart way, this precludes the investor flight stuff closing government argues. So actually your explanations for why they're asymmetric aren't currently true relative to closing government's incentive reasons. So we don't think this attempt to explain why the green industry is in more of a need than the oil industry works, particularly because you yourself say that the US has a really enfranchised and like strong tech green tech and industry, which implies by framing that both industries are quite smart, are quite strong, and maybe don't need that much support. So without that asymmetry, then it's a prioritization of which industry has the massive scale of benefit or harm per closing and opening government. It's the oil dependency industry rather than green tech industry. If, as Offbench concedes, we are less dependent upon green tech, that must mean that we're more harmed by something we're dependent upon, which is oil. This is how we see the debate. I will stick around if you want to talk and chat about the debate, but feel free to leave as free agents that you are. Good luck for future rounds.